They buried her 10 years ago, but Caleb Ward never once believed the ground had the right to keep her. And in a place like Red Hollow where dust settled faster than truth, that kind of belief made a man dangerous in ways folks didn't understand. Before we go any further, tell me something. Have you ever trusted your gut when the whole world said you were wrong? Because out here, that's the only thing a man truly owns. And Caleb held on to his like it was the last drop of water in a dry season. The day they lowered Eliza Hart into the earth, the sky hung still. No wind, no sound. Just the creak of rope and the quiet murmurs of people ready to move on. But Caleb stood back, hat low, eyes fixed not on the coffin, but on the way her hand had rested. Too still, but not empty, not finished. And when the preacher said his final words, Caleb didn't bow his head, didn't whisper him in. He just turned away and said something so quiet no one cared to hear it. I don't bury the living. And from that moment on, he became a man apart, a man who refused to let a story end just because others were tired of telling it. Red Hollow didn't have patience for that kind of thinking, not in a town built on quick judgments and faster deals. So they let him be, at first, then they laughed, then they forgot him. But Caleb didn't forget, not the way her voice sounded when it caught on certain words, not the way she looked at things like she saw more than what was there. And every year, same day, same hour, he rode out past the fence line where the grass gave up trying to grow, carrying a single white flower, nothing fancy, just something clean, something honest, and he placed it on that grave like it mattered, like she might still see it somehow. 10 years is a long stretch of silence, long enough for seasons to blur together, long enough for men to lose their edge or their faith. But Caleb kept both, quiet and steady. Even when the town started calling him the man who waits for ghosts, even when boys dared each other to follow him out there and run back before dark, even when the sheriff once asked him plain, "You still holding on to that?" And Caleb just tipped his hat and said, "Some things don't let go of you." And that was the end of it. But time does strange things to a place. It softens lies until they feel like truth, and Red Hollow settled into that comfort, into the idea that Eliza Hart was a closed chapter, until the 10th year came around, and something small shifted, something no one could name at first, just a feeling in the air, like the wind forgot its direction, and Caleb felt it before he saw it, standing on his porch at dawn, coffee gone cold in his hand, eyes tracing the horizon like he'd done 1,000 mornings before. And then there it was, not a storm, not a rider in haste, just a figure walking slow, deliberate, straight toward his land like she had nowhere else to be. And there was something in the way she moved that didn't belong to strangers or drifters, something familiar in the stillness of her shoulders. And Caleb set the cup down without a sound, his hand resting against the wood of the doorframe, steady, patient, like he'd been practicing this moment for 10 long years. And as the distance closed, the town behind him still slept, unaware that the story they buried was already walking back toward them, one step at a time. Caleb did not move when she reached the edge of his fence, not even when the morning light finally touched her face and turned that long walk into something real instead of a trick of tired eyes. Because a man who waits 10 years learns the difference between hope and truth, and he had promised himself he would not confuse the two again, not until the truth stood close enough to cast a shadow. She stopped 10 feet from the gate, close enough for him to see the dust on her boots, the way the fabric of her dress had been mended more than once, careful stitches done by steady hands, not rushed ones. And there it was, resting against her collarbone, a small silver locket catching the light just enough to pull a memory straight through him like a thread through cloth. Because that locket had never been placed in any coffin, had never been returned to the earth, and for a long second, neither of them spoke, the world holding its breath between what was buried and what refused to stay that way. The wind picked up just a little, enough to stir the dry grass along the fence line, enough to carry the faint sound of a screen door opening somewhere behind the ranch, because Red Hollow was waking now, slow and curious, and people had a way of noticing when something did not fit the shape of their morning, especially when it walked straight through 10 years of certainty. Caleb rested his hand on the top rail of the fence, not gripping it, just feeling the worn wood beneath his palm, grounding himself in something solid. And when he finally spoke, his voice did not rise, did not shake. It simply existed the way it always had, steady and deliberate. You took your time, and it was not an accusation, not even a question, just a fact laid gently between them. The woman's eyes met his, and there was no confusion in them, no searching, only recognition that had been waiting as long as his had, and she gave the smallest nod, like she was answering a thought instead of a sentence. "So did you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of miles that could not be measured on any map. And that was when the first of the townspeople reached the edge of the road, drawn by something they could not explain, boots crunching on gravel, whispers already forming before anyone dared to speak them out loud. Caleb did not look back at them, not yet, because the past had a way of demanding attention all at once, and he had learned that if you turned too soon, you missed what mattered right in front of you. So he stepped forward and unlatched the gate, slow, careful, the hinge giving a soft protest that sounded louder than it should have in the still morning air, and he opened it just enough to let her pass if she chose to. But she did not move right away. Instead, her gaze shifted past him, over his shoulder, toward the town that had already begun to gather in. Uneven lines, men with hats half raised, women with hands pressed lightly against their chests, not out of fear, but something closer to uncertainty, like they were seeing a reflection they did not remember. They looked different, she said quietly, not with bitterness, not with warmth, just observation, and Caleb followed her gaze this time, turning enough to see what she saw, a town built on decisions made too quickly, now standing still because one of those decisions had walked back into view, and for a moment no one moved, no one called out. Because there are times when even a place like Red Hollow understands that noise would only make things worse. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, the boards of the porch creaking behind him, and he spoke again, softer this time, meant only for her. "You came back for something." And it was not a guess. It was the kind of knowing that comes from carrying the same question for 10 years straight. And she looked at him once more, really looked this time, like she was measuring what had changed and what had not. And there was something in her expression that settled deeper than relief, deeper than surprise, something that belonged to unfinished things finally finding their way home. And when she answered, she did not raise her voice for the town to hear. She kept it between them, where truth tends to live longer. "I came back because they closed a story that was never theirs to end." And somewhere behind them, a single voice tried to speak and failed, swallowed by the weight of what those words might mean. Because the impossible was no longer a rumor walking down the road. It was standing at the gate, waiting to be let all the way in. The gate remained open between them, a narrow space that felt wider than the 10 years behind it. And still she did not step through, not yet, as if crossing that line would make something permanent that neither of them was ready to name. And Caleb understood that kind of hesitation because waiting had taught him that some moments are not meant to be rushed. They are meant to be held until they reveal what they truly carry. Behind him, the town had grown from a handful of quiet watchers into a full line of eyes and breath and shifting weight, boots scraping dirt, voices starting and stopping like men unsure whether they were allowed to speak, because Red Hollow had never been a place that handled unfinished business well, and now it stood face to face with something it had buried too quickly. A man near the front, older, hat in his hands instead of on his head, took a step forward and then stopped, as if the ground itself had reminded him where he stood, and the silence stretched again, not empty, but full of things unsaid, full of decisions made a decade ago now pressing back against the people who made them. Caleb finally moved off the porch, one slow step at a time, boots finding the same worn path they had followed for years, until he stood just inside the gate, close enough to her that he could see the fine dust caught in the strands of her hair, close enough to notice that the locket had been opened and closed so many times the hinge had softened, and that detail settled something in him deeper than any words could, because it meant she had carried more than distance, she had carried memory, and memory does not travel light. "They wrote your ending for you," Caleb said quietly, not looking at the town, not giving them the weight of his attention yet. Folks tend to do that when they are in a hurry, and she let out the faintest breath, not quite a laugh, not quite relief, something in between, something that sounded like agreement without surrender. "They needed it to be simple," she replied, her eyes drifting past him again, tracing the faces that now could not look away. Simple stories are easier to live with, and there was no anger in her voice, no sharp edge, just a calm that made the truth land heavier than any accusation ever could. The sheriff, a younger man than the one from 10 years ago, shifted forward from the crowd, his badge catching the light in a way that felt almost too bright for the moment, and he cleared his throat like he was stepping into a role he had not practiced enough. "Ma'am," he began, careful, measured. This town believed. But he stopped before finishing, because belief suddenly sounded like a weak thing to stand on, and she turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, not with respect, not with dismissal, simply with presence. "You believed what was easier than the truth," she said, still calm, still steady, and that was all it took to quiet him. Because there are moments when a man realizes he is speaking from a place that cannot hold up under light. Caleb watched it unfold without stepping in, without raising his voice, because this was never going to be settled by someone else speaking for her, and he knew that better than anyone. So instead he reached into his coat, slow, deliberate, and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth, something he had carried with him every year out to that grave, something the town had never seen because it was never meant for them. And he held it for a moment before offering it forward, not forcing it into her hands, just placing it between them like he had done 100 times in silence. And when she looked down, her fingers tightened ever so slightly at her sides, because inside that cloth was the one thing that had never been buried, the one thing Caleb refused to give to the ground, and for the first time since she arrived, something in her composure shifted, not breaking, but bending, just enough to show that whatever she had come back to finish, it had started long before this morning, and somewhere behind them, a voice finally found the courage to ask the question everyone had been holding. "Where have you been all this time?" And the words hung there, fragile and late, because the answer was not going to fix anything. It was only going to change what came next. The question settled over the yard like dust that refused to drift away, and for a moment no one moved. Not Caleb, not the sheriff, not the men who had once spoken loud enough to close a story they did not understand. Because there are questions that do not ask for answers. They ask for consequences. And Eliza Hart did not turn toward the voice that asked it. She kept her eyes on the cloth in Caleb's hand, on the shape of something familiar wrapped in years of quiet, stubborn faith. And when she finally reached forward, her fingers did not tremble. They paused, just for a breath, just long enough to feel the weight of what had been carried for her. And then she took it, slow, careful, like it mattered more than anything else standing in that moment. The cloth unfolded in her hands without ceremony, revealing a small ring, simple, worn smooth along the edges where time had passed over it again and again, and a quiet murmur moved through the town like wind slipping between boards, because some of them remembered that ring, remembered the day it should have been buried, remembered the moment it was not, and suddenly memory did not feel distant anymore. It felt present, uncomfortable, alive. Eliza closed her fingers around the ring, and for the first time since she arrived, she lowered her gaze, not in defeat, not in shame, but in acknowledgement, as if something long delayed had finally found its place. And when she lifted her eyes again, she did not look at Caleb first. She looked at the town, at the men who could not meet her gaze, at the women who held their breath like they might lose it if they let it go. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not accuse. It simply existed, clear and unshaken. "I was not lost," she said, and the words did not echo. They settled, heavy and precise. "I was sent away." And that was enough to shift the ground beneath every person listening. Because being lost is an accident, but being sent away is a choice, and choices have names attached to them. Caleb did not move, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not in surprise, but in recognition of something he had carried without proof, something that now stood in front of him, spoken out loud, and behind him, the older man who had stepped forward earlier took another step, slower this time, like he was walking into something he could not step out of again. "That is not how it happened," he said, but even to his own ears, the words sounded thinner than they should have, like a story told too many times without being questioned, and Eliza turned her gaze toward him, not sharp, not cold, just steady. And in that steadiness was something harder to face than anger, because it left no room to argue. "It is how you allowed it to happen," she replied, and the difference between those two sentences settled like a line drawn in the dust, clear and impossible to ignore. The sheriff shifted again, glancing between them, his hand hovering near his belt not from threat, but from uncertainty. Because the badge he wore did not come with instructions for moments like this. Moments where the past stood up and spoke in a voice that could not be dismissed. And Caleb finally stepped forward, just one step, closing the space that had remained between him and Eliza, not to shield her, not to speak for her, but to stand where he had always chosen to stand, beside what he believed in. And he spoke quietly, not to the town, but to her. You do not have to explain it all today. And there was no urgency in his tone, no pressure, just the understanding of a man who knew that truth did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, and each piece had its own weight. Eliza glanced at him then, and for a moment something softer passed through her expression, not relief, not gratitude, something steadier, something earned, and she gave a small nod. But when she turned back to the town, her voice carried just enough to reach the edges of the gathered crowd. I am not here to tell you everything, she said, and a ripple of unease moved through them, because uncertainty is harder to face than judgment. I am here to remind you what you chose to forget. And with that, the morning no longer felt like a beginning. It felt like something long delayed finally stepping into the light, and no one standing there could pretend they had not seen it happen. The words lingered longer than anyone expected, not loud, not sharp, but heavy in a way that made even the wind hesitate as it crossed the yard. And for the first time since she arrived, no one in Red Hollow tried to answer her. Because there are moments when silence is not weakness, it is recognition, and this was one of them. Caleb shifted his stance slightly, not stepping away, not stepping forward, just settling into the space beside her like a man who had already chosen his place long before this morning ever came. And his eyes moved across the faces gathered beyond the fence, not searching, not accusing, simply seeing. And what he saw was not anger, not even denial, but something quieter, something harder to carry, the slow understanding that a story they had repeated for 10 years might not belong to them anymore. Eliza held the ring in her palm for a moment longer before closing her fingers around it again, and that small motion drew attention in a way no raised voice could, because it reminded them all that some things had been kept, preserved, protected, even when everything else had been let go. And when she spoke again, her tone did not change, still calm, still steady. But there was a weight to it now that settled deeper. 10 years is enough. Time for people to forget what they did, she said, her gaze moving across the crowd, not stopping on any one face. But it is also enough time to remember why they did it. And that difference landed in a way that made a few men shift their feet, not out of guilt alone, but out of something closer to discomfort, because remembering why is harder than admitting what. The older man near the front drew a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling like he was carrying more than just age, and he stepped forward again, this time not stopping, crossing the invisible line between watching and being seen. And when he spoke, his voice carried the strain of someone trying to hold on to something that no longer fit. We made the best decision we could with what we knew, he said, and there was no anger in it, no defense sharpened to a point, just a statement that had once been enough. And Eliza listened without interruption, her expression unchanged. But when he finished, she tilted her head, slightly, not in disbelief, not in judgment, just enough to show she had heard him fully before answering. You made the easiest decision with what you chose not to know, she replied, and that small shift in words cut deeper than any argument could, because it did not deny their position, it revealed its weakness. A murmur moved through the crowd again, quieter this time, more uncertain, and the sheriff glanced back over his shoulder as if searching for something to anchor himself to. But there was nothing there but the same people who had followed his lead minutes ago, now waiting for someone else to take the next step. Caleb finally turned his head toward Eliza again, his voice low, meant only for her. You are not here for apologies, he said, not asking, just placing the truth between them. And she gave the slightest shake of her head, her grip tightening just enough around the ring to show that whatever she had come back to claim, it was not words. No, she said quietly, and then her gaze lifted once more to the town, steady as ever. I am here because what was done did not end when you buried it. And that sentence seemed to reach farther than the others, touching something deeper, something that had not been named yet, but was already beginning to take shape in the minds of those listening. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, carrying the scent of dry earth and old wood, and somewhere in the distance a loose shutter tapped softly against a frame. A small, steady rhythm that felt almost like a clock counting something down, and Eliza took one step forward at last, crossing through the open gate without hesitation now, not as a visitor, not as someone asking permission, but as someone returning to a place that had unfinished business with her. And as she moved past Caleb, she did not look back, not because she did not need to, but because she already knew he would follow, and that quiet certainty settled into the space behind her like something that had been waiting just as long as she had. She did not slow as she passed through the gate, and the sound of her boots against the hard earth carried farther than it should have, each step landing with a quiet certainty that made the town shift without realizing it. Because there is a difference between someone returning and someone arriving, and Eliza Hart was not returning to ask for anything. She was arriving to finish something that had been left undone. Caleb followed a step behind, not close enough to guide her, not far enough to seem separate, just there, steady, the way he had always been. And together they moved toward the center of Red Hollow where decisions had once been made quickly and without question, and where those same decisions now waited, patient and exposed, for someone to look at them again. The crowd parted without being told, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Like people stepping aside for something they knew they could not stop, and as Eliza walked through them, she did not turn her head, did not search for familiar faces, because memory does not need direction. It finds what it is meant to find on its own. A child near the edge of the street tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered something too soft to carry, and the mother only shook her head slowly, eyes fixed ahead, because there are moments when even explanations feel out of place. The sheriff stepped forward again, but this time he did not speak right away. He simply walked until he stood a few feet ahead of her path, not blocking it, not challenging it, just placing himself where he could no longer pretend this was happening somewhere else. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the edge of authority it carried earlier, replaced by something quieter, more careful. "If there is something that needs to be set right," he said, choosing each word like it mattered, "this town will listen." And the sentence hung there, offered without pride, without defense, and Eliza slowed just enough to acknowledge it, her eyes resting on him for a brief moment before moving past. "Listening is where it should have started," she said, and then she continued forward, leaving the weight of that answer behind him. Caleb glanced at the sheriff for a second, not in judgment, not in agreement, just in recognition of a man standing in a place he had not chosen but now had to hold. And then he looked ahead again, because this was not about who spoke next, it was about what would be seen next. They reached the old courthouse steps, weathered boards that had carried more decisions than anyone cared to remember, and Eliza stopped there, not climbing them, not stepping aside, just standing at the base as if measuring something invisible, and for a long second nothing happened, no voice, no movement, just the quiet presence of a place waiting to be used for something it had not been built to hold. She opened her hand slowly, revealing the ring once more, its worn surface catching the light in a way that felt almost deliberate, and she held it there, not raised, not hidden, simply visible. And that small act drew every eye in the street, because objects carry stories in ways people sometimes cannot, and this one had been carried too long to be ignored now. "This was never buried," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the gathering without strain, because someone here knew it did not belong in the ground. And without turning, she let that truth settle where it needed to, and Caleb felt it land in the same place it had lived in him for 10 years, quiet but unshakable. A man in the crowd shifted forward, younger than the others, his hat pulled low, but not low enough to hide the way his eyes flickered toward the courthouse door and then away again. And Eliza noticed, not because she was looking for him, but because she had learned to see what others tried not to show, and she took one step closer to the stairs, still not climbing, just closing the distance between where she stood and what waited behind that door. The wind moved again, carrying a faint creak from the building as if it remembered something too, and Eliza spoke once more, softer this time, but no less clear. "Some things were signed in that room," she said, her gaze steady on the door. And some of them were never meant to be. And she did not need to say more, because the implications settled deeper than any accusation. And for the first time since morning broke over Red Hollow, the town was not waiting for her to speak again. It was waiting to see who would move first. No one moved at first, and that was the strangest part. Not the return, not the words, but the stillness that followed, because Red Hollow had always been a place of quick hands and quicker decisions, and now it stood quiet like a man who finally realized he had spoken too soon 10 years ago. Eliza did not turn from the courthouse door, her gaze steady on the weathered wood, as if it could answer for what had been done inside. And Caleb remained just behind her shoulder, close enough to hear her breath, steady and controlled, the kind of breath a person learns when they have spent years carrying something that could not be spoken out loud. The young man in the crowd shifted again, more noticeably this time, his boots scraping against the dirt as his eyes flickered once more toward the courthouse. And that small movement was enough. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough for the truth to begin finding its way out of hiding. Because guilt does not always speak. Sometimes it simply looks in the wrong direction too many times. Eliza saw it. Of course she did. And when she finally turned from the door, she did not face the whole town. She faced him, just him, her eyes settling on his like a question that had already been answered. And the air between them tightened, not with anger, but with something heavier, something that made the rest of the town lean in without realizing it. You remember, she said, not accusing, not asking, just placing the words where they belonged, and the young man swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat as if it might steady him. But it did not, because some memories do not fade, they wait, and his had just been called back into the light. I was told it was settled, he said, his voice low, uncertain, the kind of voice that had never been tested until now. And Eliza took a small step closer, not threatening, not pressing, just closing the space enough that he could not pretend she was far away. Settled is not the same as true, she replied, and the difference landed like a quiet weight on every person standing there. Caleb watched without interruption, his presence steady, his silence louder than anything he could have said, because he understood something the others were only beginning to see, that this moment was not about proving anything. It was about remembering what had been chosen when it mattered most. The older man lowered his head slightly, not in shame, but in recognition, and for the first time since morning, his voice did not try to explain, it simply admitted, "We did not look hard enough." And that sentence, simple as it was, shifted something deeper than all the others, because it did not defend, it did not excuse, it only acknowledged, and sometimes that is where truth begins. Eliza held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, small and deliberate, as if accepting that piece for what it was, not enough, but not nothing either, and she turned back toward the courthouse steps, her hand closing once more around the ring, the metal catching the light just enough to remind them all that something had been kept when everything else had been let go. "Then we start there," she said quietly, and this time when she moved, she did not stop at the base of the steps. She placed her foot on the first board and let it creak under her weight, the sound carrying through the silence like the opening of something long sealed, and Caleb followed without hesitation, one step behind, the same distance he had kept since she walked through his gate, not leading, not following blindly, just present, exactly where he had always chosen to stand. The sheriff exhaled slowly and stepped aside, giving them space without being asked, and one by one, the townspeople shifted, not leaving, not turning away, but making room for something they did not yet understand but could no longer ignore. And as Eliza reached the top of the steps and placed her hand on the courthouse door, she paused, just for a breath, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because whatever waited on the other side was not just paper and ink, it was the part of the story they had all agreed to forget, and now it was waiting to be opened again. The door did not open right away, and that pause, brief as it was, carried more weight than any speech given that morning. Because hesitation at the threshold of truth is not fear, it is understanding of what waits on the other side. And Eliza Hart stood there with her hand resting against the worn wood, feeling the years pressed into it, the countless hands that had opened and closed it without question, without doubt, without ever stopping to ask what should have been asked. Caleb stood just behind her, close enough to hear the faint shift of her breath, and he did not speak, did not move to help, because some doors a person has to open on their own, no matter how long they have been waiting to reach them. The town held still behind them, the weight of watching settling into something quieter now, less like curiosity and more like reckoning, because this was no longer about a woman returning. It was about what her return would uncover. Eliza pushed the door slowly, and it gave with a low creak, the sound carrying out across the street like a signal that something had finally begun, and the interior of the courthouse revealed itself in soft morning light, dust drifting through the air in thin, slow lines, settling on old desks and shelves that had not been touched in ways that mattered for years. She stepped inside. Without looking back, her boots sounding different on the wooden floor, firmer, more certain, and Caleb followed just behind. The door left open behind them so the town could see, could not pretend later that they had been left out of what happened next. Inside, the room felt smaller than it should have, like time had pressed in on it, and along one wall stood a row of cabinets, dark wood, iron handles worn smooth, holding records that had once decided who owned what, who stayed, who left, and sometimes who was remembered and who was not. Eliza walked toward them with the same steady pace she had carried since dawn, not rushed, not uncertain, and when she reached the middle cabinet, she stopped, her hand hovering just above the handle as if she could feel the right one without needing to check, and for a moment she did not open it. She simply stood there, letting the silence fill the space, letting the weight of 10 years settle into that single point. Caleb watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition, because this was not a guess. This was memory guiding her hand, and that meant whatever had happened here had not been forgotten, not by her. Outside, a few townspeople edged closer to the doorway, not stepping inside, not crossing that line yet, but close enough to see, to hear, to witness, and the sheriff moved with them, stopping just at the threshold, his presence no longer about control, but about bearing witness to something he now understood was larger than his badge. Eliza finally closed her fingers around the handle and pulled, the drawer sliding open with a soft resistance that spoke of years without movement, and inside lay rows of documents, yellowed at the edges, tied with string, labeled in careful handwriting that had once carried authority without question. She reached in without hesitation and pulled out a single file, not searching, not scanning, just taking what she already knew was there, and when she turned back toward the door, she did not hold it up, did not present it like evidence. She simply held it at her side, the paper catching the light enough to show it existed, enough to remind those watching that something written long ago was about to be seen again. "This is where it changed," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying out into the street without strain, and the words settled deeper than any accusation could, because they pointed not to a person, but to a moment, a decision, a place where things could have gone differently and did not. Caleb stepped slightly to the side, giving her space, not to distance himself, but to make sure she stood fully in view, because this was her moment, her truth, her return. And when she finally lifted the file just enough for the nearest eyes to see the name written across the top, a name they all recognized, the air shifted again, quieter, heavier, like something long buried had just taken its first breath, and no one standing there could pretend they did not know what came next. No one spoke when she lifted the file, not because they did not have words, but because the name written across the top had already said enough, and in a place like Red Hollow, names carried weight far heavier than paper ever could. Eliza did not rush to open it, did not flip through the pages like someone trying to prove a point. She simply held it there, letting the silence stretch until it became something each person had to stand inside. And Caleb watched the shift move through the crowd. Outside, slow and undeniable, the way a truth travels when it no longer needs to be chased. The sheriff took a step into the doorway, not fully inside, not outside either, caught between where things had been decided and where they were now being questioned, and his eyes fixed on the file, then on Eliza, then back again, like he was trying to understand how something so small could hold so much. "That record should have been sealed," he said finally, his voice low, not commanding, just uncertain, and Eliza turned her head slightly, acknowledging him without giving the moment away. "It was," she replied, and then after a pause that carried its own meaning. Just not for the reason you were told. And that answer did not raise its voice, did not press forward, but it settled deeper than any challenge could, because it left room for what had been hidden to stand. On its own, Caleb shifted his weight quietly, his eyes never leaving her, because he had learned something over 10 years that the rest of them were only beginning to see. That truth does not need to be forced into the open. It simply needs a place to stand where it cannot be ignored. Outside, the older man lowered himself onto the edge of the wooden railing, not out of weakness, but because the ground beneath him no longer felt as certain as it had an hour ago, and the younger man who had been called out earlier stared at the file as if it might call his name next, his fingers tightening around the brim of his hat until the shape of it bent slightly under pressure. Eliza finally opened the file, not wide, just enough to let the top page fall into view, and the faint rustle of paper carried through the quiet room, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and she ran her thumb along the edge of the page, not reading it aloud, not yet, just acknowledging its presence, like a person returning to a place they had never truly left. "You said you believed what you knew," she began, her voice calm, measured. "But this is what was written before you decided what to believe." And she turned the page slightly, angling it so the nearest eyes could see the lines of ink, the signatures, the marks that had once passed without question and now stood exposed under the same light that had watched her walk back into town. Caleb stepped closer to her side, not to shield, not to guide, but to stand where he had always chosen to stand, beside what he knew to be right. And he looked at the page for the first time, really looked, his eyes moving across the line slowly, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not anger, but confirmation, the quiet kind that settles deeper than reaction. The sheriff leaned in slightly, just enough to catch the first line, and his breath caught for a moment before he steadied it again, because what he saw did not match what he had been told. And that difference began to stretch in his mind like a crack in something that had always seemed solid. Eliza closed the file again with the same calm she had opened it, not hiding it, not protecting it, simply holding it as it was meant to be held. And she looked out toward the town once more, her gaze steady, unwavering. "This was not forgotten," she said quietly. "It was set aside." And that distinction settled heavier than anything before it, because forgetting is passive, but setting something aside is a choice, and choices have weight. The wind moved softly through the open doorway, carrying the scent of dry earth and old wood into the room, and for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke, because they all understood now that whatever came next would not be decided by who spoke the loudest, but by who was willing to look at what had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The room held its breath after her words, and for a long moment nothing shifted except the slow drift of dust through the light, because once something has been seen clearly, it cannot return to what it was before, and Red Hollow stood at that edge now, unsure whether to step forward or pretend it had never looked. Eliza did not move from her place, the file resting steady in her hands, not as a weapon, not as a shield, but as something simpler and far more difficult to face, a record that had outlived the version of the truth the town had chosen to carry, and Caleb remained beside her, quiet as ever, his presence not demanding attention, but anchoring the moment in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. The sheriff finally stepped fully into the room, closing the distance he had held since morning, and his boots echoed softly against the floorboards as he came to stand a few feet away, his eyes no longer shifting, no longer searching for someone else to speak first, but fixed on the file as if it might steady him if he looked long enough. "If this was set aside," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then someone made that decision." And the sentence did not accuse, but it pointed, not toward a person yet, but toward the shape of responsibility itself. And Eliza gave a small nod, not in agreement alone, but in acknowledgement of what was finally being said out loud. "It was signed," she replied, her voice even, and then it was hidden behind something easier to accept, and she did not need to explain further, because the paper in her hand carried more than enough for those willing to see it. Outside, the town had drawn closer, the line between inside and out no longer holding the same meaning, and a few stepped onto the threshold, not crossing fully, but no longer content to remain distant, because distance requires certainty, and that had already begun to slip. The older man rose slowly from the railing and stepped forward again, his pace measured, not out of reluctance, but out of the weight of what he now carried. And when he reached the doorway, he did not stop this time. He stepped inside, removing his hat completely and holding it against his chest, not as a gesture for anyone else, but as something he needed to do for himself. "We trusted the ones who brought it to us," he said quietly, his eyes on the floor for a moment before lifting to meet Eliza's, "and we did not ask what was left out." And there was no defense in his voice now, no attempt to reshape the past into something cleaner, just the plain admission of a choice made without looking closely enough. Eliza studied him for a moment, not measuring him, not weighing his words against anything, simply seeing him as he stood now, and she inclined her head slightly, accepting the truth of what he said without granting it the power to undo what had followed. Caleb shifted his stance just enough to glance at the man, then back to Eliza, his silence holding steady, because this was not a moment for him to step in. It was a moment for the town to step forward on its own. The sheriff exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling as something in him aligned with what stood in front of him, and he extended his hand, not forcefully, not demanding, but open. "May I see it?" he asked, and Eliza looked at him for a brief second before placing the file into his hand, not hesitating, not guarding it, because truth does not need protection once it is placed where it can be read. He took it carefully, almost reverently, and opened it wider than she had, his eyes scanning the lines in full now, not just the first page, and as he read, the room seemed to narrow around him, the sounds outside fading until there was only the quiet movement of paper and breath. And when he finally looked up, something had changed in his expression, not shock, not anger, but clarity, the kind that settles in when a man realizes the ground he has been standing on is not what he thought it was. He closed the file slowly and looked toward the doorway, toward the town that had gathered there. And when he spoke, his voice carried not authority, but something steadier, something earned in that moment. "This was not the whole truth," he said, and the words moved through the room and out into the street, not loud, but undeniable, and Eliza watched the reaction ripple through the faces beyond, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with a quiet understanding that the first step had finally been taken, and that what came next would not be decided by what had been said, but by what they chose to do now that they could no longer claim. They did not know. The words did not fade when the sheriff spoke them. They settled, deeper than anything that had come before, because once a man says something is not the whole truth, he cannot return to the comfort of what was easier to believe, and Red Hollow stood in that space now, no longer able to lean on what had been told, forced to face what had been left out. Eliza did not reach for the file again. She let it remain in his hands, because this moment was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone standing there, everyone who had chosen silence over questions, and Caleb watched the shift move through the room and out into the street, slow but certain. The way change always comes when it is not pushed, but allowed to take hold. The younger man stepped forward at last, not with confidence, not with defiance, but with something closer to necessity, like he understood that staying where he was would only make the distance harder to cross later. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the certainty it once carried. "I remember the day they brought it in," he said, his eyes fixed on the file, as if it might confirm what he could barely admit. There were pages missing, but no one asked why. And that admission landed differently than the others, because it did not come from age or reflection. It came from someone who had stood close enough to see and still chose not to act. The older man closed his eyes briefly, not in refusal, but in acceptance of what that meant. And when he opened them again, he did not look at Eliza, he looked at the younger man, and there was something in that look that passed between them without words. Something that spoke of shared responsibility that could no longer be divided. Eliza listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, not distant, not engaged in a way that demanded more, simply present, allowing the truth to take its shape without forcing it into something else. And when the silence returned, she spoke again, not louder, not sharper, but with a clarity that settled deeper than any raised voice. "You did not need all the pages to know something was wrong," she said, "and The simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than anything written in the file, because it spoke not to what had been hidden, but to what had been seen and ignored. Caleb shifted slightly, his boots pressing into the floor with a quiet firmness, and he glanced toward the open doorway where the town stood, watching, waiting, no longer separate from what was happening inside. And he spoke for the first time since the sheriff had read the file, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach beyond the room. "Truth does not wait for permission," he said, not directing it at anyone in particular, not accusing, just placing it where it could not be avoided, and the words moved through the crowd like something familiar, something they had known once but had not held on to. The sheriff looked down at the file again, then back up, and there was no hesitation left in his expression now, only the understanding that what came next would define more than what had already been done. "Then we do not close it again," he said, and it was not a command, not a declaration of authority, but a choice spoken out loud, one that others could follow or refuse, but could not ignore. Eliza met his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that something had finally shifted, something that had taken 10 years to reach this point. And she turned slightly, looking once more toward the town, toward the faces that now held more questions than answers, and she spoke one last time in that moment, her voice steady, grounded. "What was done cannot be undone," she said, "but what comes next is still yours to decide." And she let that settle where it needed to, because the story was no longer about what had happened. It was about what they would choose now that the truth stood in front of them, no longer hidden, no longer set aside, but fully seen. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt full, like the moment before a storm decides whether to break or pass. And Red Hollow stood inside that moment with no place left to step back to, because once a choice is named, it does not disappear again. Eliza did not speak further. She had said what needed saying, and now she simply stood there, still and composed, the ring resting in her palm once more, not displayed, not hidden, just present, as it had always been. And Caleb remained beside her, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, a quiet reminder that some things do not waver simply because time passes. The sheriff closed the file carefully, not with finality, but with intention, and he looked toward the doorway again, toward the people who had gathered there. And this time when he stepped forward, it was not to observe, it was to act, not loudly, not with force, but with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing there is no longer a way to stand still. "We will reopen the record," he said, his voice even, carrying through the room and out into the street. And the words did not sound like a command. They sounded like a correction, something being set back into place after sitting wrong for too long. And a few heads in the crowd lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of what that meant. The older man nodded once, slow and deliberate, and this time when he spoke, there was no hesitation left in him. "Then we will stand with it," he said, and it was not a promise made to Eliza, not something offered for approval. It was something he placed on his own shoulders, a weight he had decided to carry. The younger man glanced between them, uncertainty still in his eyes, but something else beginning to form beneath it, something quieter, something that did not need to be named yet. And he took a small step forward, not enough to be noticed by everyone, but enough to matter to himself. Eliza watched it all without interruption, her gaze moving from one face to another, not judging, not forgiving, simply seeing. And when the sheriff placed the file on the nearest desk, not to hide it, but to leave it open for anyone willing to read, she gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the first step had finally been taken. Caleb glanced at her then, just briefly, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, not relief, not satisfaction, but a quiet easing, the kind that comes when something carried for too long begins to settle into its rightful place. The wind moved through the open doorway again, lifting a corner of the page just enough to reveal a line beneath it, and a few in the crowd leaned forward, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to responsibility, because reading it meant accepting it, and accepting it meant change. Eliza turned slightly, her attention shifting away from the file, away from the room, and back toward the street beyond, the place that had once closed its doors to her without question, and she stepped forward, not away, not leaving, but moving into the space that had once been denied to her, and Caleb followed, just as he had before. One step behind, not leading, not trailing, simply there. As they reached the doorway, she paused for a brief moment, not looking back, not needing to, and she spoke once more, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry. "Truth does not return to punish," she said. "It returns to be seen." And then she stepped out into the light, leaving the rest of the sentence unspoken, because what came after that did not belong to her anymore. It belonged to the town, to what they would choose to do now that they could no longer pretend they had not seen it. By the time they stepped back into the street, Red Hollow no longer felt like the same place it had been at sunrise, not because the buildings had changed or the dust had settled any differently, but because the silence now carried awareness instead of avoidance, and that kind of silence does not fade quickly. Eliza moved forward without looking back, her steps steady, measured, not hurried, because there was nothing left behind her that needed her attention anymore, and Caleb followed as he always had, one step behind, not out of distance, but out of respect for the path she had walked alone for 10 years before this morning ever came. The townspeople did not part this time, not out of instinct, but out of choice, stepping aside one by one, not lowering their heads, not turning away, but watching her pass with a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes when something has been understood, even if it is not yet resolved. The older man remained near the courthouse steps, hat still in his hands, his shoulders no longer carrying the same quiet certainty they had held earlier, and when Eliza passed him, he did not speak. He simply nodded, not asking for anything, not offering anything, just acknowledging that something had been seen clearly at last. The younger man stood a few feet behind him, his posture uncertain but no longer closed, his eyes following the direction she walked, not with fear, not with doubt, but with the beginning of something else, something that might take time to form but had already begun. The sheriff remained in the doorway, the file still resting open on the desk behind him, visible to anyone willing to step inside, and he did not call out, did not try to bring the moment back under control, because control had never been what was needed, only clarity, and that had already arrived. Eliza reached the middle of the street where the light fell strongest, and for a moment she slowed, not stopping, just allowing the warmth of the morning to settle around her, and she opened her hand once more, looking down at the ring that had crossed 10 years of distance without ever touching the ground it was meant for, and there was no triumph in her expression, no relief. Only a quiet stillness that comes when something long carried has finally been placed where it belongs. Caleb stopped beside her then, not behind this time, not ahead, but level, and for the first time since she arrived, they stood the same distance from everything around them, and he looked at her briefly, not searching for answers, not asking for anything, just seeing her as she was now, no longer a memory, no longer a question, but present, undeniable, real. She closed her hand around the ring again and lifted her gaze toward the horizon beyond the town, where the road stretched out in long, quiet lines that did not promise anything, did not ask anything, only existed, waiting for whoever chose to walk them. And after a moment, she spoke, her voice low, meant only for the space between them. "You kept it." And Caleb gave a slight nod. Nothing more, because some things do not need explanation, they only need to be done. The wind moved gently across the street, carrying with it the faint sound of the courthouse door shifting on its hinge behind them, and somewhere in that small sound was the understanding that something had been opened that would not be closed again, not the same way, not without being seen. Eliza took a step forward, then another, not leaving in the way she once had, not disappearing into something unknown, but walking with intention, with direction, and Caleb fell into step beside her, not following now, not leading, simply walking with her, and behind them, Red Hollow remained where it was, changed in a way that could not be measured, only lived with, and as the distance between them and the town slowly grew, there was no final word, no declaration, only the quiet truth settling into place, that some promises are not kept to bring something back, they are kept so that when it returns, it finds the world ready to see it for what it truly is.